You know, you throw the ball and then you go get it, or you hit the ball and then you go get it. That's golf. And while I enjoy the golf, although it's been quite a few years since I've played, I still think it's kind of a silly game because you hit the ball and then you go get it. Our gospel reading for this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount. It's chapter Matthew 5, church verses 13 through 20. Oh, you have 15 through 20. Okay, well, then I'm going to give you a couple of verses before you get to 15. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how will its saltness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by people. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, nor do men light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. Let your light so shine that people may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Think that not that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. This is the word of the Lord. Oh, one other little thing before I begin. I loved it, Merle, that when you went up to give your week of compassionate talk, right at the microphone, you stood on your toes. And you stood that through the entire intro. I just was just fascinated by that. I kept looking. Yeah, she is. She's standing on her toes. I thought that was great determination on your part. Thank you for getting the word out. So, bless you. Bless you. So today we continue with Jesus's platform, his statement of philosophy that is the what we commonly know as Sermon on the Mount. And it's the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of Matthew that has all this theology of Jesus essentially in it. And we're still in chapter 5, and I don't believe that we get to chapters 6 and 7 until maybe a little later on in the year, but I've got to check that. It's time for me to go back and study again. Um, so we have this passage, verses 13 through 20, and that was my fault, not Eric's, for not sending in the right one. So I apologize. But what is in this passage, I think, is something that's pretty extreme. And part of what's going on here, of course, is that Matthew is using the content of the Torah, the Hebrew law, to convince people then, the Hebrew people, that Jesus was the Hebrew Messiah. That's the intent of the Gospel of Matthew. And so there's a lot of reflection on the law and the commandments. And next week, we actually will be covering a section that does cover several of the top 10 commandments. This week, he sets the stage for that because he kind of makes a preface statement to his dealing with the Torah. He starts by saying, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. Don't think, and this is a really strange statement, don't think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. Rather, I have come to fulfill them. That's a pretty strong statement. But it's one that would have resonated a lot with the Hebrew people at the time. They would have wanted a Messiah who regarded the Torah, the Hebrew law, with reverence. But, boy, it kind of hits us. We've been raised on the substance of God being a God of love and grace. And so if we take this for what it appears to say, it can hit us pretty hard. He says that those who practice all of the commandments will be considered great in the kingdom of heaven, and that unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and scribes, you won't be a part of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so we're supposed to be salt of the earth and light of the world. Jesus was using metaphors, and he was doing it specifically to point out the failures of a lot of those who supposedly follow the commandments. You are the salt of the earth. Salt was a very precious commodity in that time, in Roman times. It was not only used for flavoring food, it was also used for preserving food. Anyone who's ever had any salt pork or beef jerky knows about the importance of salt. But as salt loses its flavor, it loses its purpose. I've had table salt, which over the course of years suddenly lost its taste, and it was just kind of letting sand dissolvable sand in my mouth. It just didn't have much there. Salt of the earth is that which holds life together, its sustenance and its meaning. You've heard about salt of the earth people. Maybe you are one of them. Those who evidence goodness and love without a lot of the flippery or status or a lot that people strut around engaging with. To be salt of the earth is to be simple, good, unaffected by a lot of things that a lot of other people pursue. And then you are the light of the world. To be the light of the world is to be a person similar to salt of the earth whose goodness becomes a beacon to the goodness of others in the world. Some hide their light. Why do they do that? Why do we do that? Either through fear or not wanting to call attention to ourselves. But Jesus is saying that the light of goodness is so badly needed to shine in a world that all too often is all too evil and dark. One of the biggest challenges of church today is finding ways to let our light shine, getting out there, showing God's love, particularly letting people know that we're here in a place that's kind of hidden in the city of Cheyenne. But then comes this troubling part in the 5th chapter of Matthew, the part that says that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the sacredness of the law is more important than anything else. What the heck is going on here? Isn't God's grace more important? I mean, that's what I've been preaching for the last 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, but who's counting since I've been here? Well, part of what's going on here is that the Judaism of the time had gotten locked into a power piece where the people on top, the temple officials, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they were being the ones that were defining what Judaism was all about, what obedience to the commandments was all about. And I talked about this a few weeks ago where I mentioned the outcasts called the Elohim. The Elohim who were deemed not worthy of the temple because the power structure said, no, you're unclean. No, you're not worthy. So part of what's going, and Jesus spent his time in his ministry embracing the Elohim, the outcasts, the people who weren't worthy. Now, in this circumstance, then, what Jesus was showing was that his own knowledge of the law, the Torah, the 625 to 632 commandments, depending on how you want them, was something that he knew pretty good. He knew the law. What he was also trying to say, though, was that just following the rule and the rote of the law, of the commandments, was not enough. That there had to be a spirit of faith and a commitment and a passion and an investment that goes beyond the text. And finally, he's pointing to himself. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Being a follower of Jesus is like being one who does observe not the letter, but the spirit of the law and the prophets. You see, elsewhere in the Gospel of Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is asked the question, what is the greatest commandment? And it happens in Luke and Mark as well. And Jesus' initial response to that question is straight out of the Torah. He says, the first is this, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. And then he says, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But then in Matthew's gospel, he goes on and he makes one more statement. On these depend all the law and the prophets. Now think of the context of that. On these depend all the law and the prophets. And I think that this passage about the great commandments into this, take that passage about the great commandments into this passage about the law and the prophets, and the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets, I think what that does is allow it all to come together in such a way that allows the grace to happen, the spirit of the law, rather than just following the letter of the law. I mean, it may be fine to take ritual baths and butcher your meat in a certain way and not mix threads of different materials together into cloth and encourage children to honor their parents and not commit adultery. But what's really important, what really fulfills the law and the prophets, is loving God with all heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving neighbor as self. Jesus is trying to get us off the rules and into the actions led by the Spirit. Now, one of the things about that is that it's sometimes easier to follow all the rules than it is to actively love. Isn't it? It's easier to follow the rules about meals and hygiene and observing Sabbath than actively loving people. The first is a lot safer. But it is the second that is much more of a priority, because it is the active loving on which the kingdom is built. Building the relationships is more important than building the structures of the religion. Building people up is more vital than making sure the right utensils are used for a meal. Well, we put a lot of energy into getting all those other things set up. In the ministry of the church, they can't hold a candle to getting out there and actively loving. Sharing good news of that love and caring for one another in ways that build authentic Christian community. While the commandments of the Torah were good for putting the culture of the Hebrew people together after their departure from Egypt, and that was the purpose of the Torah in a lot of ways, is to build that culture, because they had no culture before that time other than Egyptian. The commandments of love are really the goal of being the servants of God Most High. And I think that's the point that Jesus was trying to get across in this passage. So what are we called to do? We're called to be salt of the earth people. We're called to be the light of the world. We're called to be the living embodiment of the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. That is Jesus in our midst. Share the good news, people. Amen.